The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the bonus show. Very interesting stories to discuss today. We've talked since the horrible mass shooting in Christchurch, New Zealand, about the speed with which we've seen New Zealand move forward on actually dealing with the gun issues that they have. And New Zealand's government, which has already had all sorts of accomplishments just in the short time since the event, is planning to create a registry of all guns in the country, and they're going to further stiffen penalties on both illegal gun sales and modifications. And this is, again, just 6 months after that gunman killed 51 people at a number of mosques in Christchurch. And there are a couple interesting things to consider here, Pat, and really what it goes to is the culture and religion of guns, as I like to refer to it. In New Zealand, we have seen a very different reaction to this incident. There has not been the same degree of having to cite bogus catchphrases and talking points about how the problem is not guns, how guns shouldn't be looked at all. It's only mental health. It's only whatever, sometimes race-related assertions. It's just been a much more sort of united front that all of the other things that are factors can be factors and we can deal with them, but we need to do something about the guns themselves. And so that the reaction from people has been very different to what we see in the United States, but also the sort of agile nature of the government to make things happen has been interesting. It's very easy to say, listen, when you have a country that is only a few million people rather than the size of the United States, it's much easier to be agile the same way that small corporations can move more quickly than big corporations. But part of it is just the way that they are thinking of this. And I think it's to be commended, quite frankly.
Yeah, I think they just have a better approach to this. The gun culture over in New Zealand is a lot different from what we have here in the United States. And I think they're just taking the situation at hand and coming up with sensible solutions to these problems. Be it a registry, sometimes that's the best way forward. Sometimes it's a buyback program for certain firearms. And I think they can just kind of have a rational conversation about it without getting tied up, clutching the Second Amendment, the Constitution. They can just think about what's going to create the best results, what's going to lead to the fewest amount of deaths, be it from homicides or be it from suicides by gun. And they're just thinking totally rationally about it. I don't think we have the same approach here in the United States, because if we did, we'd see much different results.
One of the things, I don't know that I'd say my view has shifted over the last year on gun safety, but I think that my priorities have been tweaked, maybe is a better way of saying it. And I'm curious where you are on this. I am increasingly convinced that in a vacuum, banning certain types of weapons is a very tiny part of the solution. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. Like, I still do think that there are particular types of weapons and certain ammunition regulation that are sensible, and I'm glad to have as a part of a comprehensive program. But the more and more research I do, the more I think that the banning of particular weapons is far less the issue compared to much stricter licensing and regulation, making ammunition significantly more expensive, eliminating all background check loopholes, whether it's the boyfriend loophole, the gun show loophole, or whatever the case may be, looking at licensing of guns, a registry, insurance, like all these other things. I do believe that it's fine to look at certain particularly deadly weapons and say these just shouldn't be allowed. And of course, some will remain because they're already in the black market and whatever else. I'm okay with that. But I think that it is a relatively small piece of the bigger issue that we have to deal with and the ways in which we should be dealing with it.
Well, the problem with this stuff is that so many suggestions are just non-starters. Like Beto O'Rourke at the most recent debate talked about how he wants a gun buyback program, which is basically a gun confiscation program for certain types of firearms. I think AR-15s, AK-47s. That's just not going to happen. I mean, that's just not the climate that we live in here today. We can't even get basic things passed like background checks. I think that's where we have to start the focus, right? With the red flag laws, universal background checks, magazine capacity limits. And then from there, once we get that stuff solved, once we get all that figured out, we can sort of move on, because that's, of course, not going to solve all of our problems. We also have to sort of, I think, delineate between what's going to work to stop all gun crime versus just mass shootings, because those are totally different animals. Mass shootings, they typically are committed with those military-style assault weapons. If we try to just ban those specifically, I think that we can significantly cut down on the mass shooting epidemics, the ones where 40, 50 people are killed at, a school or at a mall. But those individual case-by-case shootings where, there's gang violence or, domestic abuse turns into one spouse killing another, that's a totally different issue. And I don't know if we're going to get any closer to solving those with the things that I laid out before.
I basically agree with you on that. And we have to, and there are right wingers who try to take advantage of these distinctions to justify not doing anything and basically just talking about, it's mental health or something like that. But I think that there are sensible ways in which we can acknowledge the nuance required while still saying this isn't a reason to do nothing. This is a reason to actually do more and categorize the different types of shootings and to apply solutions that work to each kind rather than to say, it's just crazy people. That's it. That's the only problem and you need to do nothing else. The FCC is proposing to launch a new 3-digit hotline for people who are feeling suicidal or going through a mental health crisis. And all else being equal, this being a terrible FCC headed up by former Verizon lawyer Ajit Pai, I think that this is actually a really good idea. And one of the things about suicide hotlines that I've always thought is when we have even given out the number on our show after talking about a prominent suicide, for example, when it's, a long 800 number, it is just much less effective than saying call 988 if you're feeling suicidal, and someone will get to you and it will be routed much the same way that 911 calls are routed based on the location of the landline or the mobile phone. So I think that we can get into all sorts of details, Pat, about this, but I think that this is a really good idea. There are all sorts of reasons why someone might not call a suicide hotline, that there is stigma attached, that they're embarrassed in some way, that they are, they don't believe that they are at the point where it's something that they need. But all of those other things being equal, not having to remember some long 800 number and just knowing in the same way that we all know 911, knowing 988, I think that it's a great idea and I'm completely in favor of this.
Yeah, we have the 3-digit number, not only for 911, we have it for 411, right? If you want to just get some information, or I think like roadside service in some states, they have a 3-digit number for that. So I think it makes total sense to have a 3-digit number for something as important as suicide prevention. As you point out, in a time of crisis, you're not going to be able to necessarily know a 10-digit number or, have the time to look it up, be thinking clearly enough to check out what that is. But if it's something that's kind of ingrained in our heads, like 911 is, through our childhood, we just learned that 988 which is the number that they're proposing, is the suicide hotline number. You're going to remember it even in a time of crisis. And I think it makes total sense. It's not something I thought about before, but I think they should move to make this change for sure.
A lot of cities also have 311. I'm pretty sure New York has it. I know Boston has it. When I had an issue once with like a tree from a neighbor's yard or something, I call 311, and then they sort of route you to, you need to talk to the park service or you need to talk to whoever. The second layer to this is that if you do set up 988 or whatever number, you are likely going to increase demand on these hotlines. Right now, the way it works is when you call, I forget it's like 800 something talk or whatever, the current number. It's routed out to, there's something like 160 different crisis hotlines and centers that it will be routed to. And already there are sometimes significant wait times because the crisis centers themselves are underfunded. So setting up 988 is fine. It's relatively straightforward. It's relatively inexpensive. What we really need to make sure is that when people call whatever the number is, that they are relatively quickly able to get to someone, a live person who is competent and qualified. And that means we also need to take seriously the funding of the crisis centers themselves. And as people can probably guess, they are not particularly well funded right now.
Yeah, I think increasing the demand to the line, that alone is good because that just means that more people are calling in. But yes, you're right, you have to keep up with the demand. And many people working for the hotline are just volunteers. Some are paid clinicians. But yeah, I mean, you have to kind of couple this change with more investment. And I don't know if I necessarily trust the Trump administration to do that. They can come up with something simple like changing the number from 10 digits to 3. That's not going to cost a tremendous amount of money, but actually coming up with the resources to make sure that people get the help that they need, that's going to cost something.
There is an incredible story I learned about yesterday about a man named William Moult who disappeared 2 decades ago. He was 40 at the time. This happened in Palm Beach County, Florida. And he had called his girlfriend from a bar that night to tell her he would be home soon. And he was seen leaving the bar by himself, getting into his car, didn't appear drunk, according to everything that we know. And that was the last time that anyone saw him alive. And the man has now been found, or sadly, the remains of the man have now been found because of someone who was looking at Google Maps, Google Earth specifically, when they noticed something in a small body of water, a retention pond. There's all sorts of these retention ponds in Florida that often are surrounded by homes, or there's different reasons why these are built in developments. They saw something, and it turns out that it is indeed this man who has been missing now for 22 years, dating all the way back to 1997. And of course, I think, Pat, that at this point, most people figured that he had died, that it wasn't just he went to Thailand and was alive and hiding out or whatever. And it doesn't make the disappearance any less tragic. It will maybe provide some closure. But it is incredible that merely by looking around at Google Earth, this is someone that was now found and a missing persons case was closed.
Yeah, and I guess you can discover a lot of things if you're willing to take the time on Google Earth and just look around. Like, there have been shipwrecks that have been rediscovered, boneyards that have been rediscovered, weird patterns in the desert. Maybe it was done by aliens, who knows? But people have found those too. And like it's kind of just, it's an interesting thing because if you're taking a picture of the entire world, who knows what you're going to come up with. Same thing with Google Street View. I've seen the Google car go by before, and I've just thought about like, well, it looks like I'm going to be on Google's website in a few months once they update the pictures, and who knows what else you can find on there. Probably some weird, creepy stuff.
There are people who use these types of, I guess we would call this a success of the technology, even though really it's the person who was looking at it that is really the person who just used the tool to do something, and it's used to justify more algorithmic surveillance of different kinds. So this depended on someone actually finding the remains of this individual by looking at a really small section of the planet on Google Earth. What if Google Earth was connected with machine learning where it could actually learn to identify what appear to be human remains, corpses, whatever term you want to apply to it, and therefore we could maybe make a lot of headway closing a lot of missing persons cases. And then, of course, immediately the privacy advocates, and I'm not belittling them by any way, in fact, it's a movement I'm very sensitive to, come out and say, yeah, but at the same time, that's exactly the type of thing that could open up the door to what is effectively warrantless surveillance of individuals and all sorts of other things. And I'm very much open to being influenced on this general issue of privacy versus security. There is no question that I'm aware of the degree to which video surveillance drastically increases the chances that a particular crime is solved. At the same time, I'm aware that the warrantless bulk surveillance that the NSA engaged in and continues to engage in for a very long period of time has not made us particularly safer and has not prevented mass acts of terror the way we were told that it potentially would. So this is one of those areas where I see the pros and cons on both sides. There's an interaction with the Constitution and the rule of law that needs to be considered, but I am not a sort of big-time evangelist one way or the other on it.
Yeah, and I think if governments had set up the infrastructure for Google Earth, certainly, I mean, like the satellites and stuff, that all came from government initially, but, you know, if it was the government running Google Earth, I think people would be a lot more cautious about, wanting to even allow that to happen. I think that they wouldn't necessarily go along with it. But because it's Google, I think there's a little bit more acceptance there. And, we already have given up our rights to privacy in a sense. I mean, if Google Earth takes a picture of the Earth, even every few months, is it that much of a stretch to say that in the near future, we could get a monthly update to those photos or a daily update to those photos, or we can just have a constant video up in the sky of people and what they're doing and everything on Earth at all times. And at what point will we draw the line? At what point will we say that this is too much power in the hands of Google and we just don't want to see this anymore?
Well, a couple things. One is the government already has access to real-time satellites where they can zoom in and track any vehicle or a person if the person is outside and identifiable. And the question is, what does it do if the average person potentially gets access to that? The other thing is, does the separation between Google and the government, does that distinction make as much difference when we know that there are all sorts of different backdoors that these big tech companies have been willing to build in for government in some cases? And I just don't know. I'm just asking the questions because increasingly when you are the size of Google and you operate in a regulatory environment where you're depending on technology, including satellites that are in the end regulated by the government, how relevant is the separation where we're okay if Google does it, but not if the government or vice versa? It is a distinction, and I'm wondering what the practical differences are as we go forward. I don't know what the answer is. I mean, these are just the things we're going to have to contend with.
Yeah, and it's crazy how Google is becoming much more powerful in some ways than the government. I mean, they have access to if you're using Gmail, they have all your mail. If you have Google Calendar, all your calendar items.
Yeah.
Apparently, pictures of your home and pictures of everything in the street. And, maybe financial documents, stuff that the government may not even necessarily have access to, or if they're going to try to get access to it, they would have to file a subpoena. Google is, and in many ways, has surpassed the power of the government. And that's kind of a thing that I don't think that the founders ever intended to happen. I don't think that people even saw it coming 20, 30 years back, but it's here and it's the world that we're living in now.
I think it's less interestingly about whether they intended it, but whether they accounted for it when they were establishing many of the frameworks on which society today is still based. And that is an argument for the need to keep the Constitution and the infrastructure current, which of course originalists and textualists, as they call themselves, are against. But alas, that's a sort of different conversation. I am coming to you remotely this week. Some folks will notice that I have my EV RE20 with me. This is because it was requested by people who said, David, bring a better microphone with you when you're remote. Unfortunately, there is some horrible hissing noise, which we have partially corrected with audio filters after the recording of the show. So I apologize for the sound quality today. I am going to try a different microphone for tomorrow's program. And eventually we are going to get the right best setup for when I am remote. It didn't happen today, but hopefully by the end of the week, we will make it happen. New show, new bonus show tomorrow. Thanks for joining me.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.